Hey, welcome everybody to this ESRC Festival of Social Science public webinar. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome everybody to this event with us this evening. We've had over 450 people register to attend the webinar, and we're really pleased that there's such a broad, diverse audience interested in hearing about the presentation we're going to give this evening. We know that we've got teachers, we've got parents, we've got people from the autistic community, we've got charities, all sorts of organisations represented in the people who have registered to attend this evening. So we're really pleased to be able to speak to all of you. I should introduce myself. I'm Professor Debbie Ryby. I'm a developmental psychologist, and along with Dr. Mary Hanley, will be giving this presentation today. And Mary and I are co-directors of the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development at Durham University. The aim for this evening is that we are going to start off by telling you about the research that we've been conducting over recent years on what we're calling TripleA, attention, arousal and anxiety within the classroom, with a particular focus on autistic pupils. We're then going to lead into a panel discussion event, and we've got some fantastic members of the advisory panel for this project who are going to be joining us for that panel discussion this evening. If you do have questions during the event, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A tab. We may have time for some of those questions at the end of the event this evening. If we don't, what we'll be doing is putting together a document of frequently asked questions of any core topics that have come up in that question and answer tab, and we'll send this out to you along with the link to the recording of the webinar, which will be provided as soon as it's available on our website. And everybody who's registered on Eventbrite will be sent a copy of that link to the recording and the frequently asked questions. So we're really pleased to be able to join you this evening and looking forward to sharing our research with you. First of all, we should introduce everybody who has contributed to this work and who continues to do so as we take forward the development of the TripleA support package. So I've introduced myself and Mary Hanley. At the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development, the work that we're going to present to you has been conducted by a number of members of our centre, especially two of our PhD students, Liz Jones and Emily McDougall, and more recently, Jess Hurst. But all of the team has contributed to the programme of research that we're going to tell you about today. We're really pleased to be working very closely with the communication and social interaction team from Durham County Council on this project. And with the educational psychologists and team at the council, we've been really pleased to be able to drive forward how we can put some of our research into practice. The toolkit that will come out of this resource, the TripleA toolkit, is being co-produced as well with Curious 12, our web designers and online content creative agency, who are working with us to provide the very best support in the package. And we really couldn't be doing this without our expert advisory panel on this project. So we have members of the autistic community, experts in their field, parents and autism researchers coming together to provide guidance to us to help with the co-production of putting some of our research into practice. So it's really important for us to emphasize that this really is a broad team project.
Super, thanks very much, Debbie, for the introduction and getting us started. Actually, I'm going to start by saying a little bit about what we mean when we talk about TripleA issues in the classroom and why they're important. And I'm really going to start by thinking about the classroom environment because, as you can see in this image, which I think is probably a fairly typical representation of classrooms up and down the country, the classroom is a really busy multisensory environment. And actually, there's lots of things that children have to filter out and ignore in order to be able to engage and to pay attention and to learn in the classroom. So, for example, we could think about all of the sensory stimulation from the physical classroom environment. So we might be talking about bright lights, all the very engaging and colourful classroom displays that we tend to decorate our classrooms with. We might also be thinking about the noise and the bustle from the activity of sometimes up to about 30 children in a typical classroom with teachers and teaching assistants and support staff. So actually, it's quite a bustling, it's quite a noisy, it's quite a busy, and it's quite an unpredictable environment often. Some children find that very easy to manage, and for a lot of children that doesn't really bother them very much. It's but for some children, particularly children who have differences or difficulties with attention, with arousal, and with anxiety, actually that kind of stimulation and that those aspects of the classroom can be challenging. So what do I mean by attention difficulties? Well, having attention difficulties means it can be very difficult to just stay focused on a task, especially when there are other things to capture attention. Having arousal differences means that everyday sensory inputs that most people might take for granted or not even really notice, they can be either hyper arousing, which can be a very overwhelming and distressing experience. They can be hypo arousing. That means that these sensory inputs might not be noticed by some children in a way that they might be noticed by other children. And having anxiety means that the world feels like a very uncertain place. Anxiety is a very distressing, or can be a very distressing experience, and it can mean that it's very difficult to focus on anything else except what it is that's causing you anxiety. Some children have none of these difficulties. Some children have some. They're quite common for autistic children, and indeed autistic children tend to experience all three together. And we will be focusing a lot on the relevance for autistic people of TripleA issues in this talk, but that's not to say they're not relevant for other neurodivergent children as well. We know that from research. So for example, here I'm thinking about maybe children with ADHD or children with Williams syndrome as two examples. And what we are trying to do is use research examples, which we're going to tell you about in more detail, to around this framework of TripleA, this idea of TripleA and how these three things link together, and to try and get this message out and to translate the evidence in particular, but not just, but in particular with educators, so teachers, teaching assistants, school staff, for example, to really enhance school experiences for children with TripleA issues. And what I really want to emphasize at this point is the fantastic illustrations that you see on the slide were created for us by Ella Willis. She's worked with us on this project. Ella is an autistic person who's a digital illustrator and online content creator. And I think she's done an absolutely superb job of capturing the essence of some of the issues that we're trying to convey through this TripleA project. So her details are there for anybody who's interested in contacting Ella about her work.
So we're going to focus on research that we've been conducting over recent years in three core areas. And the overarching aim of this research programme has been to understand engagement and learning for autistic pupils in the classroom and at school. The three areas that we're going to focus on, what we call the TripleA issues, are attention in the classroom, arousal or sensory issues in the classroom, and anxiety as a barrier to engagement and learning for pupils. But the really critical point is that while we've looked at some of these issues in isolation, it's about pulling them together that we think is particularly important for understanding the holistic engagement and learning experience for pupils. We can't just study these issues in isolation. We need to think about how they interact with each other. This quote really sums it up from an autistic adolescent who's been involved in shaping some of the work that we're conducting. What I do like, it's not just for like attention, it's because I actually can't really cope if there's like a fly or something smells bad. Often things like when other kids are being quite unpredictable and when instructions are made unclear, and also like being made to queue at lunchtime. I'm not very good with that. So there is a range of issues here that touch on elements of the TripleA and all coming together to understand the experiences of this autistic adolescent when they're at school.
So what are the studies that we're referring to? Well, the first example is one on attention that I want to tell you about now. And this was really about understanding the impact that certain aspects, certain sensory features of the classroom can have on attention and learning for children. And here we focus specifically on classroom displays. So we designed an experiment to test the effect that the presence of classroom displays can have on attention and learning. And we had autistic and non-autistic children watch a series of video mini lessons. So these were video mini lessons that we created for the purpose of this experiment to test the effect of classroom displays on attention and learning. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. Children watched these series of video lessons, and we used techniques called eye tracking to measure attention. And this is equipment that allows us to measure what somebody looks at for how long in a very precise and a very accurate way. And again, you'll get a better insight into that in a minute when I show you some videos. Crucially, we measured learning at the end of each mini lesson to really get a sense of what the children retained after they had engaged with these mini lessons. And really importantly, the way we manipulated the presence of displays was in the videos that we made, half of the videos children watched had no displays present, as you see in this example on the left, and half had classroom displays present. And these were actual displays that we had taken from a classroom. What did we find? Well, the data that you can see on this graph in front of you shows the percentage of attention that autistic and non-autistic children paid to the background only when there were no displays present. And what you can see here is that, you know, both groups of children did very similar things, which is that about 10% of the time when watching videos with no displays, they were paying attention to the background. And that was broadly what we expected. So let me just show you what that looked like. And here I have an example of an eye tracking video. So this is a video that shows you the attention patterns, in this case of some of our participants. So here 8 participants who were autistic. And this was their eye tracking and where they paid attention when there were no displays in this lesson. Let me just show you what that looks like.
Okay, children, we're now going to have a lesson on a myth or a legend. Now, a myth or a legend is an old story that's passed down through people from generation to generation. In this legend, we will learn about...
So that just gives you a little sense of the attention patterns and also what eye tracking can show and what it can tell. And what you see here is that for this subgroup of children, they mostly spent their time paying attention to the teacher who was relaying the content of the lesson in this video. And then just to show you another example, again, this is from a subset of participants, this time watching a video lesson that obviously had classroom displays present.
Okay, children, we're now going to have a lesson on a myth or a legend. Now, a myth or a legend is an old story that's passed down through people from generation to generation. In this legend, we will learn about the...
And what you see here, you get a very clear sense of how the displays were quite attention capturing. And you might say, well, was that just, you know, did children just pay attention to that at the beginning? And did they then sort of pay attention to the teacher thereafter? Actually, that wasn't what we found. And so here in this graph, you can see the comparison of attention to the background when no displays were present in blue compared to when displays were present in red. And what you can see here is that all children looked much more at the background when displays were present. And this was to a significantly greater extent for the autistic participants who took part. And you might say, well, that's interesting, but of course you could look at the classroom display and actually be paying attention to what the teacher is saying. And of course that is true. But what we found that we think is important is that this looking behavior of more attention to the background when displays were present predicted poorer learning scores. And so we think that suggests that actually classroom displays can be distracting, especially for autistic pupils. Now you might say, well, that's really interesting, but how does that actually relate to a real life classroom, a real life situation? They were videos. As you can see here in this example, we've replicated this in a real life study, if you like, where children came to do reading comprehension tasks, so a self-directed task in our little pop-up mini classroom. under different conditions. So some conditions where there were no visual displays and some conditions where there were visual displays. And essentially we find the very same pattern. So the bars here in this graph showing the amount of off-task behavior and directed towards the environment, so the wall of this mini classroom. And what you see in green and purple is that when displays were present, there was much more off-task behavior than when displays were absent. And that's the same for both groups of children, but again, much more so for the autistic children who took part in this study. And so what we think here is that sensory features of the classroom can impact attention, they can impact learning, especially for autistic children. And these are things that we can make changes with. And these are changes that will, we think, support autistic children, but probably will support many other children as well.
So the second area that we're going to focus on is sensory processing and linked to arousal. To study this in more detail, we conducted a questionnaire study that involved responses from both parents and teachers to give us an insight into their perspectives of sensory issues impacting learning and school life for pupils who were autistic. We had three core overarching questions that we were looking at in this study. First of all, how to identify sensory differences affecting behaviour, what types of sensory experiences were encountered at school, and what the impact of those sensory differences might be upon learning and engagement at school. In terms of the results, teachers and parents overwhelmingly emphasised that sensory differences impacted upon learning and school life at school frequently or all of the time for autistic pupils. Over 70% of teachers believed that sensory differences affected learning frequently or all of the time, and over 80% of parents believed that sensory differences affected school life more broadly, frequently or all of the time. We asked parents and teachers how they recognise sensory issues, and most of the responses related to negative reactions, and often this related to the child already being at their tipping point or breaking point by the time that they were expressing observable behaviours that we might recognise as reactions to sensory differences. This is important because we might be missing many of the signals along the way before the child reaches tipping point. One of the examples of observable behaviour emphasised by a teacher is evident in this quote. They tried to protect themselves by covering their ears, closing their eyes, pulling their t-shirts over their noses to block out the smells. So there's various different sensory elements emphasised in this quote and clear examples of observable behaviour that teachers might be spotting as hypersensitivities and reactions to sensory differences. Of course, it's much easier for teachers and parents to spot hypersensitivities and overt reactions to sensory issues. It is much more difficult to spot hyposensitivity or sensory seeking behaviours, and this might be something that we really need to think about in identifying for pupils. The other core question we asked was about what the sensory differences were that were impacting upon learning, and we can split this into the different sensory domains. The most common type of sensory difference related to auditory stimuli. So, for example, loud and unpredictable noises, and the noises from other pupils in the class. Obviously, if you're thinking of a busy mainstream classroom where there might be up to 30 pupils in there, there are times when this can be extremely noisy, and that can be overwhelming in terms of auditory sensory stimulation. There might be also more very subtle and sensitive sensory issues, such as the sound of pencil on paper or pen on whiteboards. If we move on to think about the tactile domain, this was the second most common type of sensory differences observed. One of the overarching themes that came out in this domain was the unpredictability of tactile sensory differences. And these were not only restricted to behaviours and experiences within the classroom, but in the broader school environment as well. For example, while there might be tactile issues in relation to pupils sat around desks and working closely with each other, this could also be seen, for example, when classes were moving down a relatively narrow corridor and lots of pupils all moving together, or when sat in an assembly with lots of pupils surrounding the child. The unpredictability of those tactile issues was particularly evident. So these are really negative reactions to tactile stimulation. One of the other themes that came out was tactile seeking behaviours, much more used to relieve the child. For example, the use of fidget toys or tapping or seeking out sensory stimulation through hugging and touch, for example. So there was a great deal of diversity in the type of sensory differences that were reported by parents and teachers. If we move on to the visual domain, again, there was a really broad range of examples given by parents and teachers. And again, some of these focused on the classroom, but many also emphasized the broader school environment. So for example, fluorescent or strip lighting used in both classrooms and hallways and the broader school environment. Lots of busy classroom displays, and Mary's already emphasizes in terms of attention and distraction when engaging and learning. And as I say, these weren't just specific to the classroom. It might be about these experiences throughout the school and throughout school buildings. This was also a theme in terms of olfactory or taste sensory differences for pupils. Many of these were more about the indirect impacts because they're mostly focused outside of the classroom in the wider school environment. That's not to say that they can't still have an impact upon the child's engagement in school and potentially their learning in the classroom still as well. If a child is distressed at lunchtime because of smells and tastes from the canteen, for example, they might bring this distress and anxiety with them into the classroom after lunch. There was also the mention of issues around these sensory differences, for example, in PE or in the changing rooms, even in terms of cleaning materials that had been used to clean a classroom overnight, or issues such as the perfume that a teacher or teaching assistant might be using in the classroom. There were two ways in which parents and teachers reported these sensory differences really impacting upon the child and upon their learning. And these really fall into two domains, first of all, of distraction for the child, and then of distress and anxiety for that child. So linking to another one of the TripleA domains that we're focusing on. So distraction was by far the most common reaction reported by teachers and parents. I've got a couple of quotes here that illustrate this from different teachers. So inability to tune out noises they don't need, affecting their ability to listen to instructions and inputs. So really there are sensory issues and differences around them impacting upon their ability to concentrate and tune into the task at hand. And because if a child is more focused on what they're wearing, it distracts them from their work. So that one's focusing around tactile issues, impacting upon their differences when being able to learn and focus on their work. The two core areas of distraction, but these also link to reactions that might represent anxiety and distress within the pupil. And it might be this anxiety and distress that the parent or teacher might observe in that pupil. So for example, this quote from a parent: "She either appears anxious or angry. How can you possibly learn with all that adrenaline rushing through you? It's like asking someone to do long division when they're free falling from a plane. Not going to happen." I think this quote really nicely illustrates how can we possibly expect pupils to be learning and concentrating and engaging in the classroom when there's so many other issues that are going on. And that all of this might be coming together to impact the child across various different areas of their sensory experiences. And again, I think that's really clearly illustrated in this quote from an autistic adult reflecting back on their own experiences during their school time. Pupils in my classes were very noisy, and it could cause me to experience panic attacks and sensory overload. It would also distract me from what my teachers were saying, as I couldn't focus when two people were speaking at once. I also struggled in places that were too crowded or where the lights were too bright. So there's a range of different sensory experiences highlighted in this quote, all coming together to impact upon the engagement and learning of that individual when in a school environment and in the classroom.
So the last sort of research example that we're going to focus on really spoke volumes to the issue of anxiety. And obviously Debbie's also just explained links between sensory issues and anxiety. But in this particular study, it was an interview study with teachers about barriers and facilitators for learning for autistic pupils. And we interviewed a range of teachers from across mainstream and special education needs schools. And I think the message, excuse me, to emphasize is that when we ask teachers about a whole range of barriers and facilitators, anxiety emerged as one of the most powerful barriers. And, you know, if you're an autistic person, if you know an autistic person, or if you're somebody who you know has worked with autistic children in schools, for example, indeed, if you're a researcher who knows the literature on autism, that won't be surprising. We know a lot now about how much of an issue anxiety can be for many autistic people. I think here what's important is placing it in the classroom and placing it sort of centrally as a really important barrier in the school, in the classroom, that we need to understand. And teachers said things to us in these interviews like, excuse me, when thinking about autistic pupils they had supported, their anxiety levels go up so high they just can't think. So the sense that anxiety can just be so high for these pupils in school that it's just all encompassing and it's overwhelming, and it's really difficult to get past that and to do anything else. And in terms of what underpinned that anxiety, unsurprisingly, based on what Debbie just told you about, sensory issues were a massive contributor to a lot of anxiety that these pupils experienced. Also uncertainty. And again, from the literature, we know that uncertainty and a difficulty managing and tolerating uncertainty underpins a lot of anxiety for autistic people. And the classroom, the school by its nature, excuse me, can be a very unpredictable and uncertain environment. So there are particular reasons to think about uncertainty and unpredictability and how that contributes to anxiety at school. But also, as exemplified by this quote, there can be a lot of anxiety that comes with the fear of getting things wrong. So this parent was referring in this example to a child who had difficulty with writing, the task of handwriting, and was so afraid of getting things wrong with the handwriting, they would go to extreme lengths to avoid doing it. So that's just really exemplifying that anxiety can come from sensory issues, it can come from uncertainty, it can come from the fear of getting things wrong. And actually it proves to be a really powerful barrier to being comfortable in the classroom and in school in that environment. So just then coming back, we've given you the three separate examples, but it's really important that we remember to pull all these together, because really that's the central message that we're trying to get across when we talk about TripleA. You know, the fact that sensory issues, arousal issues are very strongly related to anxiety. Anxiety makes it very difficult to focus on anything else other than the focus of the anxiety itself. So this sense of the interaction between attention, arousal, and anxiety, and how there are specific factors related to the school environment that can provide specific challenges in this respect. We've given broad examples of all of these things, and I'm sure for whatever person you have in your mind when you're listening to this, they may not fit all of these examples. There are huge individual differences person to person in how TripleA issues manifest and impact at school. And again, we focused our examples for autistic pupils, but we know that this is relevant for other neurodivergent pupils as well. And it's really important to just emphasize that again. What we're trying to do here is use these research examples and the testimonies that we've also shared to emphasize that these are internal states, they're internal experiences that children by their nature will find very difficult to articulate. And actually what we want to do is raise awareness and understanding of TripleA issues to enable, in particular, but not exclusively, in particular educators and teaching staff and school staff to be able to recognize them and understand them. And a central idea that underpins all of the TripleA work relates to this Nordic relational model. It's a social relational model of disability. And really the message is, and the central point is that it's the mismatch between an environment and a person's skills that creates disability. And here we're trying to emphasize how there are specific aspects to school life that can create significant challenges, in particular for autistic pupils.
So we've described a program of research in looking at these TripleA issues. And now we want to focus on our aim in terms of turning some of this research into practical support and strategies to be used in schools. So the overarching aim of the last year has been to take these research examples, as well as and alongside personal testimony from the people most involved in this work, to change our understanding and enhance our understanding of TripleA issues, and to use that to provide practical strategies and support in a training package. Now, you may have noticed that a number of the examples that we have focused on, and with our illustrations from our research studies, have focused on primary school age pupils. One of the things we want to highlight is that these issues aren't restricted to primary school aged children. In more recent work that we've been doing with autistic adolescents at secondary schools, we can clearly see that these issues are all relevant at secondary school age for autistic pupils and neurodiverse pupils. And we want to emphasize that, therefore, that we think that this is all relevant across the educational spectrum. In fact, really recently, we've been doing some work with autistic university students, especially around that transition from school to university life. And really, again, we can see some of these issues coming out again for autistic university students as well. So I think although some of the examples that we've shown are from younger children, they are relevant across the educational spectrum. So to highlight what we've been doing throughout 2021, and very much led by Mary, we've done a range of different activities to build towards developing the training package on TripleA. In January 2021, a range of focus groups and interviews were conducted with key stakeholders, those most involved in this work. So autistic adolescents, parents, teachers, special educational needs coordinators, and educational psychologists to critically get a range of insights and to understand how relevant the research that we've emphasized is to those really involved in this work in the classroom and with these experiences. We've also run a range of workshops with teachers to test the materials on the training package and get their insights from on-the-ground work with pupils in the classroom. And as well as this public engagement event and webinar, we held a previous webinar earlier in the year to again get the word out there about the research that underpins the training package and really ensure that we're moving in the right direction with the TripleA training tool. We've also been really working very closely with Curious 12, the design company, the creative designers, to ensure that what we're producing is engaging and useful as a training tool. And absolutely central to the work that we've been doing and really important voices in the work that we've been doing is our advisory group of key stakeholders. And this very much has been about taking the research evidence and co-producing the TripleA training tool with the advisory group and with excellent feedback that we've received along the way from stakeholders in this co-production. We're really excited to be moving towards the launch of the TripleA training tool, and this webinar, as part of the Festival of Social Science, comes at the ideal time to be able to emphasize where we're going with the training tool prior to the launch coming after Christmas in January. The input from our advisors and our collaborators in the communication and interaction team at Durham County Council has been hugely beneficial to us. We can provide the research evidence from the studies that we've conducted over recent years, but the on-the-ground emphasis from the communication and interaction team who work with so many teachers and in so many classrooms has been hugely beneficial for the practical support for the tool and its development. And really just to emphasize that the feedback that we've been receiving along the way has been really, really positive, overwhelmingly positive. It's clear that there is a need to highlight these issues and that there is potentially a lack of understanding of some of the behaviours and some of the experiences of autistic pupils in the classroom and in engaging in learning at school. And we really have got some positive feedback that this, we hope, will help raise awareness of these issues. So in terms of co-producing the tool over recent months, we've been working with a range of different key partners. Some of the things that are really important that have come out of the co-production elements is the importance of this being a freely accessible resource available to anybody who's supporting autistic pupils in the classroom, or indeed neurodiverse pupils in the classroom. People who use the tool will register some basic information, but then it's free for them to use. And the training takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete in total. In terms of continued professional development, so for CPD, for teachers, everybody who completes the training will receive a certificate of completion to show that they've learned about these the 3 critical issues of TripleA and pulling them together. And what you'll be able to download at the end of the training tool is a toolbox of strategies and support mechanisms to be put in place in the classroom, and ideas to try at different times with different pupils to see what might suit the needs of the pupil at that time.
So as Debbie said, you know, the training will have sort of this, these sort of 2 broad parts to it, one of which is about translating the evidence in much the same way that we've done this evening, so telling you about the studies that we've done and why they're important. And then the second important bit is the practical support strategies, and again the communication and interaction team have been been tremendous with the input into this aspect of the tool. And so the idea here is that at the end of the training and in the practical support strategies bit, anybody who engages with it will be able to download their own toolbox, which will be a selection of practical support strategies that are particularly relevant and useful to them. So I'm just going to give you a brief flavour of some of, and this is only a short selection of some of the strategies that are included. So if we're thinking about supporting attention, things like doing an attention audit of your classroom. So, you know, really sort of thinking about what aspects of the environment might be distracting, and therefore could you be, you know, more selective about display use? Could you use feature walls? Could you use folding boards? So these are displays on folding boards that you can take out at the time that information is relevant to the lesson and to the learning, and actually acting as an attentional cue and almost as an attentional scaffold, but then you can put away when they're not actually relevant to the task at hand. Also making learning opportunities irresistible for pupils, and in particular maybe where you have autistic pupils that have special interests. How can they be harnessed? How can those preferences and interests be harnessed to really scaffold sustaining attention in tasks within the classroom? Thinking about arousal, a similar idea to an attention audit, and obviously these things are linked, and that's something we keep emphasizing. But doing a sensory audit, so looking at aspects of the classroom and thinking about it maybe in a different way that you might have previously. And actually we link to some sensory audit tools that you can use to implement that in your classroom. Would a child benefit from a sensory cool box? So having access to some preferred sensory calming items, and these might be individual to different children. Different children will have different preferences for what they find calming and soothing, but also thinking about the seating arrangements for access to that cool box. One of the things autistic young people have told us is that sometimes a barrier to support with some of their sensory issues is the notice and attention they draw on themselves. They really, some of our autistic adolescents have struggled with sort of bringing that attention on themselves when they need that sensory support. So if you're thinking about a cool box, can that be accessed easily without drawing unnecessary attention on the child or young person? Sensory breaks, times in the day when the child needs and then the young person needs to step back and have a sensory break. But also thinking about those breaks not just as reactive, and at that point that Debbie described earlier where things are just too much already, but building them into the day so the child has those restorative opportunities, and so that they never get to that point of things being too much. And then thinking about anxiety, a soft landing to school. So maybe not having to do that cue at the beginning of the day with all of the other children that's very bustly and very noisy. and quite anxiety provoking. Can the child have a sort of a slightly staggered by a few minutes start time where they meet, you know, a trusted school member who can bring them to their classroom in a very sort of a low demand way, supporting the young person to develop their tolerance of uncertainty. So this is things like involving the young person in planning for change and involving them in developing strategies that they think would be useful for them in terms of developing and supporting their anxiety need, particularly in relation to changes. And really importantly, working with families and that communication. So anxiety doesn't start at school and stop at home. And actually for some individuals, they can mask their anxiety quite well at school. And then, you know, the moment they get home, it's a big release, and actually it's quite demanding and challenging at home. So it's really keeping those communication lines open and really working with families to support these things. Because as I say, there's no stop-start rule. It's not just all about what happens in school and it's totally different at home. There's a cycle there, and that's really important to support. The idea of a TripleA toolbox, it's not that we're giving you a fix, you know, that's just not realistic. And a TripleA toolbox shouldn't be a static thing, okay? So the idea here is that children and young people change and develop. We're trying to give you some strategies and ideas from which your toolbox should be developed. Crucially, armed with the understanding. It's no point putting in place strategies and supports unless you understand why they work and what it is that they're supposed to achieve. And so the idea of the toolbox is giving you some of those starting tools from which you can then develop. So then just briefly coming to a close here with some final pieces of information. We're launching the tool in January, and I'll tell you about how you can keep updated about the launch in a few moments' time. But there's also new things that we're doing as well. So for example, for maybe school staff and teachers on here listening tonight, we're actually trying to develop a manualized training for the whole school. So something that you can do on TripleA that involves a whole school training that you might do maybe as part of an inset day. We're also doing lots of new research on these issues as well. So for example, Jess Hurst, who has been absolutely instrumental in a lot of the work towards the training tool that you've heard us talk about tonight. Jess has started a PhD with us, and she is taking forward some of the TripleA issues in terms of trying to develop a model for learning and engagement at school for autistic people. So not just looking at TripleA, but looking at TripleA and how it fits in with other things as well. Like, for example, some social difficulties at school as well. Also, a new piece of research that Dora and Esther, two master's students working with us, are taking TripleA forward to look at how it might provide particular barriers to engaging in physical activity and PE at school. We know that many autistic children, also other neurodivergent children too, don't engage in PE and physical activity as much as their neurotypical counterparts. And one question is how TripleA issues might actually provide barriers to participation in that respect. So new research there, and we look forward to being able to share the outcomes of that research with you soon. But you can get involved in it, and this is a really important message that we want to get across right now. If you have questions or queries about anything we've talked about, by all means email myself or Debbie, and our email addresses are on the screen. If you want more information about the TripleA, the project and things that we're doing as part of it, we have a project page on our website that gives lots of information and also some downloadable resources. So you can access the academic papers and also reports from different activities that we've done as part of the project along the way. You can sign up to our database, and here we would say please do get involved and please do sign up. So you can scan the QR code that you can see in front of you right now. You can also access the database via the website, but essentially you can sign up to receive updates. So for example, an update on when the training tool is released in January, or other events like, for example, public webinars like this one that we've done this evening. You can also sign up to get involved in research. And if there's, we want teachers, parents, and young people, neurodivergent young people to get involved in research. and you can sign up to do that via the database on the website. And for those of you who are social media savvy, we also have a new Instagram page for the TripleA project as well. So we'll communicate via the Instagram page too. At that point, I would say thank you very much for your attention while we've given you that overview of the work on our research and on the development of the training tool. And I'm now delighted to move on to the last section of this session, which is our panel discussion. So before I do that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and then I will invite our panel members who are all patiently waiting to, for those of you who are comfortable, to turn on your cameras. And I'm just going to, there we are. Hi everyone, I'm organizing things on my screen. Lovely, okay. I'm just going to introduce everyone, if that's okay, to begin with. So I'm really delighted that we're joined by our panel members, Emily, we've got Marie, and we've got Liz. And Emily, Marie and Liz are actually on our advisory panel for the development of the TripleA training tool. Emily is from 21 and Sensory, is a digital illustrator and an online content creator. Emily's autistic and she has sensory processing disorder. And for that reason, she works really hard to communicate about the impact of sensory issues for autistic people and people with sensory processing disorder. And her link to the project is that I actually heard Emily on one of her podcasts during the summertime. And I was really struck by how eloquently and articulately Emily explained the considerable impact that sensory differences at school had for her. So we look forward to talking to you about that, Emily. We've also got Marie. Hi, Marie. Marie is a parent of a 12-year-old autistic daughter, and she's also a recently diagnosed autistic adult herself. And Marie and her daughter have been really helpful with giving us feedback and input into the design of the TripleA training tool. So thank you very much, Marie, for joining us. We're delighted that you're here. And last but by no means least, we have Liz Mulholland. And Liz is the team leader for the communication and interaction team in the Send and Inclusion Service at Durham County Council. And you've heard me refer to Liz and her team and how helpful they've been as a collaborative partner on this project numerous times already. Liz's team works to support staff in schools across County Durham to understand and meet the needs of children and young people with communication and interaction differences. So thank you very much to you all for joining us. We're really pleased that you are here this evening and that you're willing to have a chat about some of the TripleA issues that we've been discussing. Emily, I wondered if it was okay if I could start with you. I've obviously heard you describe in the past some of your experiences at school and some of, in particular, the sensory impacts. And I just wondered if you'd share with everyone this evening how you feel the issues, the TripleA issues we've talked about this evening, fit with your own experiences from school.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for that very nice intro. So yeah, they definitely fit in with my own experiences at school. I always like to refer to like the visual of like a sound desk, because I felt like my faders were always like pushed all the way up and I couldn't filter through like all the sensory input that was like happening in a classroom. And the only way to sort of pull those faders down as such was when I got to like a safe, quiet place, like when I got home or something like that. Yeah, so there's just so much to process in a classroom setting, and it's a constant throughout the day, you know, it's multiple hours of this going on. And in terms of like a few examples, I was going to mention, like, for me, classrooms really did like attack every sense. So I felt like, for example, the noise of other pupils, or like the teacher, or if they're playing something on a whiteboard or something like that, or even the tone of a voice of a teacher or a teaching assistant can really affect how I feel. Things like smell in the classroom. So I think you mentioned before things like perfume, but even things like teachers bringing in their coffee or like hot drinks and stuff like that, it would really affect me. Just being near other students, the kind of bustle in the corridors, so that's kind of more of a like tactile sort of thing. And again, like uniforms, that was a really tactile thing for me and a bit of a sensory nightmare, because I always had to adapt my own uniform, because that would just take up so much of my brain space, is having to sit in this uniform every day, and I'd have to like wear a t-shirt under my uniform just to be able to cope with like the shirt and stuff like that. And again, things like you've already mentioned, like fluorescent lighting, and for me also what teachers wear can be really distracting. So teachers wearing bright clothing, or even like distracting jewelry, like chunky jewelry, I used to find would distract me for a whole lesson. just I don't know, not being able to take my mind off it, sort of thing.
And how did you manage all of that?
Yeah,
you're talking about this total bombardment. I'm just wondering how you managed it.
It's a lot. I think I didn't realise how much I would mask and just kind of get through the day. And I think I had quite a good relationship with my Senko at my primary and my secondary school, actually. And I would go at lunchtime and sit and cry in the Senko's office, because it wasn't in the bustle of the corridors or the dining room at school. It was a quiet space where I could just let everything go, because sometimes I couldn't bottle it all up all day. You know, I needed that halfway point to just kind of have a cry and then get on with the rest of the day. So I think having someone on your side like really helped. My teachers weren't that understanding of the sensory processing difficulties, because I didn't know I was autistic at the time, but my Senko was more on board, I think.
So that relationship was really, really important for you.
Yeah, I think just the fact that she knew me and just knew it was my way of coping, and that it wasn't something to be massively worried about. It was just how I managed. So yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing that experience, Emily. Marie, I'm just wondering, I mean, how much of that chimes with what you see your daughter experience, or maybe even reflecting now from the position of being newly diagnosed back on your own experiences?
Yeah, I can really relate from my daughter's point of view to what Emily's saying, and what Molly's currently going through, being 12 and being in year 8 at high school. And certainly for myself, having only recently been diagnosed, I'm spending all of my time thinking, oh, that's why I struggled so much. Oh, and the TripleA research has really opened my eyes into the struggles I did have when I was at school. It's been really enlightening, actually. And it just shows how far we've come, that we can now try and embed this into the culture of schools to help other autistic children to really thrive. And for me, that means so much. That's so important. So my daughter's biggest challenges are any kind of distraction, anything. It can be falling out with a friend before a lesson, or it can be something big on the wall, just as you were talking about before, or it can be noise. One of the examples of how she's helped at school is that they allow her to leave 5 minutes early at the end of a lesson, and then she avoids the hustle and bustle and everybody getting up, and then also the corridor. You talked about the corridor earlier. That really is quite stressful for her. And an example of where it doesn't work is that she had a different teacher, and that teacher didn't understand because they hadn't been trained. And she went to the teacher and said, I need to leave 5 minutes early. Is it okay if I go now, please? And the teacher said, well, that's not very convenient because we've not cleared up. It was a science experiment. We've not finished clearing up. So she spent the next 5 minutes really worrying about the fact that she was now going to have to go through the hustle and bustle of everything. But not only that, she then had to go through that, and that really impacted the rest of her day. So she didn't really learn in the next lesson. She was really worried and upset during lunchtime, and then that impacted her learning in the afternoon. So it just goes to show that this needs to be a consistent approach across the whole school. It really is a cultural thing. And then for me, personally, when I look back at my learning, I needed to sit near a wall. It was as simple as that. If I was at the edge of a room, and preferably at the back, but really near a wall, I learned much better. And I would get quite anxious before lessons because I needed to be at the front of a queue to try and make sure I got my space. But the biggest challenge for me was exams, because it became even more important in exam to sit near a wall. And I just remember how much easier exams were when I felt safe in the place where I was. And even something as ridiculous as my worst exam result, and this was when I was doing my degree, was when I had an exam on my birthday. And I was so overwhelmed, I now realise, that I just couldn't perform. I just couldn't perform in this environment. And if I'd had some support and maybe, I don't know, told to get there half an hour earlier or something and just talk through things and calm it all down, then I probably would have done a lot better. So yeah, I can really relate to all of it.
Yeah, I mean, you've given such a range of insights there. There's really lots to unpack, but I think one thing I would maybe pick up on and then sort of move on to ask Liz about is sort of, I guess, really on the role of teachers. I mean, we're talking a lot about teachers, and teachers in schools work really, really hard to support their pupils, and we know they're under increasing pressures all of the time. I'm just wondering, Liz, from your experiences, how do you think this training tool might help, or what else can we do?
Oh, I think this is a really, really useful training tool, Mary. And my team have been really excited to be joining you and working on this, because it's so relevant to what we see in classrooms, and it's so relevant to the conversations we have with staff in schools. So I meet lots of teachers who are really aware of the presenting behaviours of young people, and they're very concerned about that and they want to make a difference. But sometimes this presentation can be quite tricky for teachers to unpick and make sense of. And I think this training tool really helps to explain what the TripleA is, and really importantly, the interrelatedness of those 3 A's. And I think the research background that you go through within the training is just very helpful for people to make sense of better. And then, of course, it's got that lovely modular approach as well. So it's really handy for teachers who are busy, but they can pick it up, they can do it in their own time, they can do the first module and then come back to it. And we've linked it really closely to practical strategies, because teachers, that's what they ask me all the time. So what can we do about this? Now we've got our heads a little bit around this young person in the classroom, what should we do about it? So it's great that we've been able to link those tools in. Can I just make a little side comment? I've noticed in one of the question and answers, somebody's asked whether the strategies in the toolkit are evidence-based also, and the answer is absolutely yes. That everything that is suggested there is very well embedded within research and will have an evidence base behind it. So Mary, the other thing you asked me was what else could we do? And that we, as soon as we started working with you on this, we immediately identified this idea that for a single teacher in a school to complete this toolkit is fabulous. It's going to have a lovely impact for that teacher and the young people that they're involved with. But actually, young people in schools don't just come into contact with one teacher. They might have several teachers across the day and the week, and they're going to be meeting lots of adults in the school environment as well. And it's not just about being in the classroom, it's about being in the hall, or being in the yard, or being in the dining room, or the PE changing rooms, or whatever. So there's a much broader, sort of more holistic piece of work to look at here, isn't there, around how do we support a whole school with this? And I know that senior leaders and SENCOs in schools are always really looking for consistency of practice across school, and they want to make a difference. And if you want to effect change, then we need something that's going to help all the staff to understand, be on the same page, to reflect together, and to share their practice together and problem solve together as well. So that for me is really the next step. What else can we do? I think we can support senior leaders and SENCOs in providing a tool that helps them to work with all of their staff and just measure the impact of what they're doing and get that sustained progress.
Brilliant. That's brilliant, Liz. Thanks very much. And of course, that is what we're going to try to do
next.
And hopefully we'll be able to come back and tell people about that. I'm really conscious of the time actually, because we said we'd finish at 8 o'clock, but before we do, just, you know, and maybe you don't have anything else to add, but if any of you do have anything else to add, you know, please, if there's any final comments, the floor is yours.
I'd actually like to just emphasize that if this is done right, and that you're supporting those children who are autistic in a way to allow them to thrive, just the amount of energy they will have through not being exhausted from the way they have to cope at the moment, how things are at the moment, and it's a lot better than it used to be, but there's a long way to go. It will just make such a difference to their lives if they feel supportive and they've had a really positive day. Their self-esteem is going to be massive. It's going to be brilliant. Their mental health will be improved. And they'll go home happy, and then they can relax when they're home. They're not worrying about the next day, and it will literally transform their lives. And just to think of the impact that would have just on my child, never mind everybody else's autistic children, it's just mind-blowing. It's just absolutely brilliant. So I think it's just a fantastic thing to get involved with, and I just hope that so many schools adopt it, and it just does become part of the culture of our education system.
Well, I mean, if that's not an ambition, I don't know what is. And I think that's a lovely point really to end on. But maybe just on that note, to everybody who's still with us, you know, if you want to be part of that goal, please do sign up to get updates, and please do sign up to take part in the ongoing work that we're trying to do around TripleA. A reminder, we're going to send you all out the link for the recording, and a couple of other bits of information as well. I know we have Q&As that we haven't actually got around to answering here and now, and we are over time. So I think what we'll do is what Debbie suggested at the beginning. When we email everybody out after the end of this, we'll try our best to respond to some of those questions as well, and send that out to everybody. So just really to end and say thank you especially to Liz and Marie and Emily for joining myself and Debbie, because your experiences and your expertise are extremely valuable and important, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us. And thank you everybody for listening in. We hope it was a useful session.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody. Good night.